Story 1. My friend Jacob works for the city's CCTV archives, and let me tell you, he's seen things no one should ever have to. I hadn't caught up with Jacob in months. He'd been swamped at work, and our usual weekend hangouts had become a distant memory. Then, out of the blue, he called me on a Thursday evening, asking if I wanted to come over for drinks. His voice sounded unusually heavy, like he was carrying the weight of the world. That alone was enough to make me accept without hesitation. When I arrived, Jacob had already started drinking. His words were slurred, and there was a shadow in his eyes that only deepened as the night wore on. I couldn't ignore it anymore and finally asked what had been bothering him. He hesitated, then admitted it was work-related. His voice dropped as if he feared the walls might overhear. Now, I'd never really known much about Jacob's job. I knew he worked in the city's tech department, specifically with the CCTV surveillance system, but the specifics were a mystery. That night, though, he opened up and described it all in unnerving detail. Jacob explained that the city was blanketed with thousands of cameras, from the bustling downtown core to quiet suburban neighborhoods. His job was to categorize and archive the endless streams of footage these cameras captured. Most of the recordings were routine, mundane moments of everyday life stored away in massive hard drive farms, identified by cryptic combinations of letters and numbers. The footage was essentially meant to be forgotten. To manage the overwhelming task, Jacob had designed an AI system to sift through the footage. It flagged anything unusual for him to review. The system was efficient, catching anomalies and saving Jacob from watching hours of uneventful footage. Most flagged clips, 99.99% of them, were ordinary incidents, traffic violations, petty thefts, and the occasional wandering animal. Then there was the 0.01%. These were the car crashes, assaults, abductions, and murders, the kinds of events that left a mark on a city's collective consciousness. But even more disturbing was the 0.0001%. Those clips were stored in a classified archive Jacob referred to as the Tartarus Archive. The name, he explained, was no coincidence. In Greek mythology, Tartarus was a prison so deep and dark that it was reserved for the worst of the worst. The kind of place you didn't just lock someone away in, you buried them there. The footage in Tartarus defied explanation. While some clips could be dismissed as strange optical illusions or the erratic behavior of drug addicts, others were impossible to rationalize. Those clips haunted Jacob, keeping him awake at night. He admitted he'd been breaking protocol, taking home external hard drives filled with these aberrations. He'd even started splicing together repeat occurrences, crafting sequences that revealed patterns too bizarre to ignore. When Jacob offered to show me some of the clips, it didn't feel like he was showing off. It was more like he needed someone else to carry the weight of what he'd seen. I hesitated, worried about the implications, but my curiosity got the better of me. Jacob led me to his workspace, a cluttered room with towers of hard drives and multiple monitors. After some nervous rummaging, he pulled up a file labeled Link Inspector and hit play. The first clip was grainy black and white footage of Lincoln Avenue at 3 a.m. The street was desolate, lit only by dim streetlights. From a side road, a woman appeared, walking briskly toward the camera. She glanced over her shoulder and screamed, her terror palpable even without sound. Suddenly, she took off running. The camera switched to another angle, capturing her frantic sprint. The strange part? She was alone. No one was chasing her, yet her fear was undeniable. The sequence continued as the woman ran into an empty intersection. She fell, then cowered as if something invisible loomed over her. Her body went rigid, and she began to levitate. It was as if some unseen force was lifting her by the throat, her limbs dangling like a rag doll's. Then her head snapped to the side, and she crumpled to the ground. The screen went black. I sat frozen, my mind racing. Jacob watched me carefully before muttering, "You haven't seen anything yet." He queued up another video, this one labeled Black Crab. It was longer, and the title alone sent a chill down my spine. The clip began in the subway station at Walkley, the last stop on the line. The platform was empty, the tunnel at the far end swallowed in darkness. Suddenly, the lights went out and the camera switched to night vision. First, there was nothing. Then, movement, a figure emerging from the tunnel. As it drew closer, my stomach turned. It was a man, but he was crawling on all fours, his back arched unnaturally so his stomach faced upward. His long, matted hair dragged along the ground, and his clothes were in tatters. Jacob called this figure the Black Crab, and it was easy to see why. The man moved jerkily yet with unsettling speed, scaling stairs and squeezing through locked gates with an ease that defied logic. The video continued, showing the Black Crab reappearing night after night, dragging small animals back into the subway tunnels. Eventually, it escalated to something far worse. A homeless man, attacked and consumed in a shadowy alley. Jacob revealed that authorities had linked the Black Crab to a man named David Fletcher, a once successful lawyer who had lost his family in a tragic fire. The man had disappeared years ago, presumed dead after throwing himself in front of a subway train. But somehow he'd survived, twisted into the creature we now saw. Jacob moved on to the next video, codenamed Cloud Mirror. This one, he said, was the most troubling yet. Jacob loaded the Cloud Mirror file, and every monitor in his workspace lit up, displaying 5 different street intersections downtown. The footage was time-stamped to the same date and time. The streets were eerily quiet. No cars, no people, just the occasional flicker of streetlights. Then, at the exact same moment on all 5 screens, something appeared. A small orb of light pulsed into existence in the middle of each intersection. The orbs hovered, growing slowly from the size of a bowling ball to that of a beach ball. Their glow intensified, casting strange, rippling patterns on the pavement. Then, as abruptly as they appeared, the orbs vanished. The intersections returned to their lifeless stillness, leaving only the faint hum of the recording equipment in the room. "What are those?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jacob shook his head. At first, I didn't know. Just anomalies, I thought. But then they started to change. He clicked on the next clip, recorded several weeks after the first. Again, the intersections lit up with glowing orbs. But this time, the light morphed, expanding outward like smoke unfurling in slow motion. What had been orbs were now dark, swirling clouds, pulsating and growing until they resembled writhing volcanic plumes. Their shapes shifted constantly, never settling into anything recognizable. The footage zoomed in on one of the clouds. Up close, its surface appeared alive, folding and curling into fractal patterns that defied comprehension. It wasn't just light or gas. It was something else entirely, something alien. Then the clouds began to move. Slowly at first, they drifted down the streets, gliding through empty intersections and weaving around buildings. The cameras followed, cutting from angle to angle as if they, too, were drawn to the clouds' hypnotic dance. Suddenly, the clouds stopped. They hovered mid-street, lowering until they stood upright, their gaseous forms molding into tall, coffin-like shapes. The shifting patterns on their surfaces grew more frenetic, almost agitated. And then, on one of the screens, people appeared. A small group stumbled down the street, clearly drunk, laughing and shoving each other. When they saw the cloud, they froze. Their laughter faded, replaced by wide-eyed fascination. Slowly, they approached, their steps unsteady but purposeful. The closer they got, the brighter the cloud became. The streetlights around it flickered wildly. One of the group, a young man, broke away and stepped into the cloud. His body disappeared into the swirling mass without a sound. The others didn't react. Instead, they followed. One by one, they walked into the cloud, vanishing from sight. Moments later, they began to reemerge. But something was wrong. The first man stepped out, his movements stiff and mechanical. His face was expressionless, his eyes vacant. The rest followed, each emerging in the same unnerving state. They stood in a perfect circle for a few seconds, murmuring something inaudible to the camera. Then, without a word, they dispersed, walking away in different directions with eerie synchronization. The same scene played out on the other monitors. Different people, different clouds, but the same pattern. Groups approached the clouds, entered, and reemerged changed. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Jacob, what the hell is this? What are they doing to those people? I don't know, he admitted. But I think they're being replaced. I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to say he was joking. But his face was dead serious. He loaded the final clip. This one's from earlier this week, he said, pouring himself another drink. I wasn't going to show you, but you need to see this. The footage showed a quiet downtown street. In the middle of the intersection, one of the clouds hovered, pulsing faintly. A middle-aged couple walked into view, holding hands. The man had a noticeable limp, favoring his right leg. As they approached the cloud, their pace slowed. They stared at it, captivated. Then, without hesitation, they stepped inside. A moment later, they reappeared. The man's limp was gone. He walked perfectly upright, his movements smooth and deliberate. The couple exchanged a brief glance, then continued down the street as if nothing had happened. I turned to Jacob, my heart pounding. Do you know who they are? He nodded grimly. That was my boss and his wife. Story 2. I was my dad's only child. Being a daughter, you'd think that would make him protective. Instead, he became the source of my nightmares. The beatings were regular, the other horrors even worse. When you're 6 years old, survival is your only focus, and running away isn't an option. I should have known it was coming that Friday night. My mother and I had been sitting in the quiet tension of the house after sunset. It was just us, waiting. The inevitability of what would come next hung heavy in the air. Go, Lily. Go sit in the closet and wait for me, Mom whispered, her Cuban accent soft but firm. She always tried to protect me, even though I didn't fully understand what she was protecting me from. Back then, I didn't know what a restraining order meant or why it never seemed to stop him. When the low rumble of his truck's engine filled the air and the sharp scent of exhaust seeped through the vents, my stomach turned. The sound of the car door slamming was my gauge for how bad it would be. That night, the slam was so violent it shattered the driver's window. It was going to be the worst yet. I froze in the closet, my small body trembling as I focused on anything but the fear. 2 ants crawled across the floor, carrying potato chip crumbs. I latched onto that image, trying to dissociate, trying to escape what I knew was coming. Helena! Helena, you bitch! That door better be unlocked. His roar thundered through the house, followed by the splintering crack of the front door being kicked in. I stayed rooted to the floor, heart pounding, tears streaming silently. The sound of my mother's body hitting the kitchen floor snapped me back to reality. Mom didn't even get the chance to fight him off this time. There was no shouting, no struggle, just silence. Lily, baby, Daddy's home. Come out, and Daddy won't be mad. His voice slurred and thick, heavy footsteps dragging unevenly through the house. He was more drunk than usual, which only meant more danger. Mom had always told me to hide in different places, but never once did she say to run. I think deep down, she knew that leaving me alone would only bring me closer to him. I sat there, a helpless spider trapped in a flashlight's beam, unable to make a decision. The creak of the staircase began, one step at a time. My breath caught. Lily, here I come. Better be special for me tonight. His taunting voice echoed in the still air, each word driving nails of dread into my chest. And then silence. I squeezed my eyes shut. Maybe he fell. Maybe crack. The familiar sound of the broken top step gave him away. He was here. The door to the bedroom creaked open slowly. I heard the rattle of the shower curtain being torn from its rings. He was checking the bathroom first. My heart raced. He was outside the closet now. The scrape of metal on wood told me he had the bat. The bat. He'd broken my legs with it once before. My hands reflexively traced the scars on my arms, as if bracing for new ones. Silent sobs racked my small body. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't stay frozen, knowing what was waiting. Somehow I managed to stand. Tears blurred my vision as I reached for the closet door, preparing to step into the shadow of his towering figure. If baby girl's in the closet, come out, wherever you are. His mocking sing-song voice turned into a guttural grunt. And then a dull thud. The vibration of the floor told me he'd fallen. This was my chance. My legs shook as I bolted out of the closet, adrenaline propelling me forward. I raced for the door, ready to leap over his drunken, unconscious body and run to the back door. But I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing in the hallway was my mother, her face calm, her body unscathed. At her feet was my father, motionless. An axe was buried deep in his back. I stared at her, my small chest heaving, tears of shock and disbelief pouring down my cheeks. She knelt down to my level, her warm hands cupping my face. Her eyes met mine, steady and full of love. "Mama found a good hiding spot, baby," she said softly. "Daddy's never going to hurt you again." Story 3. I had no intention of buying shoes that day. It was just one of those moments where your feet carry you into places you never expected. I was on my usual walk home from work, tired from the day's grind, my sneakers starting to wear thin. My mind was lost in the usual worries. Rent due, bills piling up, and the nagging feeling that I wasn't where I thought I'd be by now. I was walking along the main street, passing familiar storefronts with their neon lights flickering. And then I saw it. A small shop that I'd never noticed before. The sign outside read Saul's, with the tagline beneath, "Walk in their shoes." Something about it caught my eye. Maybe it was the unique phrase or the curious vintage look of the store, but I was drawn to it. My own sneakers, the ones that had seen better days, seemed to look at it too, almost as if they were giving me a sign. I hadn't been shopping for shoes in ages, but something about the sign made me think, why not? I pushed open the door. A little bell above it jingled, and the warm scent of leather filled the air, mixed with a hint of dust that made the shop feel older than it probably was. The floor creaked as I stepped inside, the dim light casting shadows across rows of shoes that stretched back into the store. Some neat, others stacked in haphazard piles. An old man stood behind the counter, his graying hair and beard adding to the shop's antique charm. He looked up as I entered, his eyes sparkling behind thick glasses. "Good afternoon," he greeted me, his voice low but warm. "Looking for anything special?" "Oh, I'm just browsing," I answered, trying not to sound too awkward. I had no idea what I was doing in a place like this. He nodded, not seeming bothered by my lack of commitment. "Take your time. Let me know if you need help with anything." I wandered deeper into the shop, my eyes scanning the shelves. The shoes were unlike anything I'd seen at regular stores. Each pair seemed to have a history of its own. The leather well-worn, the soles faded from use. Some of them were pristine, like they had just been polished, while others had creases and scuffs that hinted at a life well lived. There was something about them that made me feel like I was walking through someone else's memories. Shoes that had traveled far, walked through adventures, survived heartbreaks, and endured the mundane of daily life. Each one had a story to tell, and for some reason that intrigued me. I wasn't sure why I felt this way, but it was almost like the shoes were calling out to me. The first pair I picked up was a classic set of black loafers. Simple but elegant, something I could wear to work, maybe for a date night. They were scuffed, worn, but the leather had been well taken care of. The buckle was still shiny, the stitching sturdy. They looked expensive, even though the price tag didn't suggest they were. I carried them to the next aisle, where I spotted a pair of white sneakers, Air Force Ones. They had some stains, maybe from years of use, but they looked like they could be restored. I liked the idea of bringing something back to life, making something old feel new again. These would be my project, I thought. The third pair I found were rugged boots, dark brown with worn soles. They had a thick, tough look to them, perfect for winter. I imagined walking through snowstorms in them, trudging through puddles on rainy days. They seemed dependable, like they would never let me down. By the time I had picked up the boots, I was feeling like a kid in a candy store. I didn't know why I was so drawn to them. Maybe it was the allure of owning shoes that had lived before me, that had seen things I could only imagine. Maybe it was the promise of stepping into someone else's life, even for a brief moment. With all three pairs in hand, I approached the counter, feeling a bit ridiculous but oddly satisfied. The old man was typing something into the register, but he looked up as I dropped the shoes onto the counter. "You sure you want all three?" he asked, his voice calm but questioning. "These aren't ordinary shoes, you know. They've been worn by people who've passed. I froze, the words hanging in the air. What do you mean? I asked, unable to hide my confusion. He smiled softly, as if he expected the question. Each pair comes from someone who's gone, someone who no longer needs them. There's a connection with each pair, something a little more personal. I didn't fully understand, but the idea was intriguing. I'll take them, I said. There was something about the way he spoke, something that made me feel like these shoes were more than just objects. They were fragments of lives lived. As I paid, the man packed the shoes into sturdy brown boxes. He handed them to me with a peculiar look in his eyes. Take care of them, he said, his voice softer now, and take care of their stories. I nodded, unsure what to say. I left the shop with the boxes under my arm, the weight of the shoes oddly comforting. As I walked home, the day seemed to fade around me. The evening sun cast long shadows, and the cool air felt refreshing against my skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just bought something far more significant than a pair of shoes. When I got back to my apartment, I put the boxes down on the table. For a while, I just sat there, staring at them. I don't know what it was, but something about the idea of walking in someone else's shoes started to settle deep inside me. I couldn't help but wonder what their lives had been like. Who had worn these shoes? What had they done? Where had they walked? I picked up the loafers first. The leather was softer than I expected, and the buckle clicked as I twisted it in my hand. I slid my foot into one of the shoes, testing it out. The fit was perfect, like they were made just for me. But as soon as I slipped the second shoe on, something strange happened. A wave of dizziness hit me. My vision blurred, and I felt like I was being pulled in two directions at once. I blinked, trying to shake off the sensation, but it only grew stronger. The room around me started to fade, and I could hear a soft beeping noise, like the sound of a hospital monitor. My breath quickened, and before I knew it, I was no longer in my apartment. I opened my eyes to a sterile, white room. The walls were bare, the floor cold beneath my feet. My heart pounded in my chest. I was lying in a hospital bed, but it wasn't my room. I didn't recognize the bed, or the machines, or the faint smell of antiseptic in the air. I looked down at myself. The clothes I was wearing weren't mine either, loose, faded hospital scrubs. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, unresponsive. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I realized I wasn't alone. I turned my head slowly, my gaze landing on an older woman lying in the bed beside me. Her skin was pale, her hair thin and silver. Her eyes were closed, but I could sense her presence, as if she had been there for years, waiting for something, waiting for me. I looked at her, confused. Who was she? I didn't recognize her at all, yet she felt so familiar. My hand moved instinctively to hers, and her fingers squeezed mine weakly. Tears sprang to my eyes before I could stop them. I didn't know who she was, but it didn't matter. In that moment, I felt a deep, inexplicable love for her, like she had been my entire world. She looked so fragile, so exhausted. I knew she was leaving me, but I didn't know why. "Mom," I whispered, though I wasn't sure why I said it. I didn't even know if it was true, but the word felt right. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, and she smiled faintly. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. Not yet." Tears fell from my face as I stared at her. "I don't want you to go," I sobbed, my chest aching with a kind of pain I couldn't explain. "I can't do this without you." Her smile remained, bittersweet. "You can, son. You've always been strong. Stronger than you know." I gripped her hand tighter, but as I did, a strange sensation filled me, like I was starting to fade away from the moment. My surroundings blurred, and I felt like I was being pulled away from her. The beeping of the heart monitor slowed, each sound dragging me further into a strange, suffocating feeling. She closed her eyes one last time, and I knew it was over. I didn't know how I knew, but I could feel her slipping away. In a final act of love, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "Take care of Gigi for me." The words hit me like a bolt of lightning. Gigi, my sister. A name, a face, flashed in my mind. But it was gone as quickly as it came. Who was she? Why couldn't I remember? I looked down at my mother's lifeless body, and the tears came flooding. I couldn't stop crying, my body shaking with grief. It was as if the weight of my entire existence had just been ripped away. She was gone, and all that was left was me, and an overwhelming emptiness. Suddenly, the window beside the bed creaked. The cold breeze rushed in, and I found myself standing in front of it, staring out at the darkening sky. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I felt like I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The ground below seemed so far away, and yet the pull to jump was overwhelming. A thought crossed my mind. If I could just escape this pain, this loss, maybe I wouldn't feel so hollow. Maybe I wouldn't feel so empty. Without thinking, I climbed onto the windowsill. My legs wobbled beneath me as I stared down at the drop below. My hands gripped the frame tightly, the wind biting into my skin. I thought of my mother, of her words, of Gigi. They were fading, slipping further away, just like everything else. I took a deep breath, closing my eyes for just a second, and then, without warning, I let go. The world rushed up to meet me,